Hi, and welcome back to our APES flipped classroom, where we're continuing our conversation about Unit 5, which is all about the ways we use our land. So today we're going to be talking about ecological footprint, which is just a way we measure how much land we're using. And we're also going to be talking about sustainability and how we can use that land in a way that protects the earth for our generation and future generations. So we're going to talk about what a footprint is and how we use it in environmental science. So an ecological footprint is just a measure of how much usually an individual, but sometimes a group, consumes, and it's expressed in an area of land. And when we talk about it, we want to recognize the different things that go into our eco footprint. So it considers the amount of land that is required for food production, the amount of land that's required for raw materials for all the consumer goods that we purchase and use, the amount of land that's required not only for our house to be built on, but again, for those raw materials for the housing. And then the fourth consideration is electricity production. And that takes into account the amount of land to harvest the material that is used to produce our electricity, but it also takes into consideration the amount of land that's needed to absorb the carbon dioxide that is produced by that electricity production. It also takes into consideration the amount of waste that we produce and therefore how much landfill space is required. So it looks at all of the things that we consume, as well as the need to dispose of waste both in the form of carbon dioxide and in the form of actual physical waste. So we measure ecological footprints in land, and we talk about biologically productive hectares or arable land. So we're not considering the entire earth as when we talk about how many globes we would take up. We're only considering the arable land. But when we talk about it in general, if we're not talking about specifically globes, we're talking about hectares. Hectares is the metric unit of area, and that's 2.5 acres. It's important to make a distinction between an ecological footprint and our carbon footprint. So our carbon footprint is measured in tons or metric tons of carbon dioxide produced per year. And our carbon footprint contributes to our ecological footprint, but our ecological footprint covers more than just a carbon footprint, because the carbon footprint is just taking into consideration how much carbon dioxide you emit. It's how much carbon dioxide is released, again, by an individual or a group. And this again takes into consideration the amount of carbon dioxide that is released in production of your material goods, production of food, as well as energy use. And that is both electricity, heat, and the gas to fuel your cars. So what are some of the things that affect the global footprint or ecological footprint? So things that increase our footprint, generally speaking, the more wealthy an individual or a group is, the larger their carbon footprint is going to be and the larger their ecological footprint is going to be. And that's because people with more wealth tend to have larger homes, they travel more, they use more material goods. All of those things are going to increase the footprint. Also, wealthier and people in more developed nations tend to eat more meat. Meat requires far more land, more water, and more energy per calorie than vegetables and grains do. And so that tends to increase the footprint significantly. And finally, again, wealthier people, more developed countries use a lot more fossil fuels. Electricity is a big contributor to this, but also travel and our use of plastics, because plastics are made from petroleum. And so that's a big use of fossil fuel. So given that we live in a developed country, we tend to be in the global scale, we are certainly on the wealthy end. How can we decrease our footprint? So here are things that people can do to decrease their footprint. One big contributor is using renewable energy, so wind energy, solar energy, hydroelectric energy, even geothermal energy. So using some form of renewable energy. Using public transportation, because that reduces the amount of gas. If you can't use public transportation, carpooling, anything that we can do to decrease the use of single use of vehicles. Switching towards a more plant-based diet will also decrease the footprint, again, because meat is such a significant contributor to both land use and carbon dioxide production. And just in general, less consumption, less travel, less energy use. Okay, so if the whole world lived like us, we can talk about the number of Earths that would be required if the entire world consumed the same level of resources as an individual does. And the current average US footprint is 5.1 Earths. So if the entire world had the same consumption habits, food, electricity, housing, as an American, we would use 5.1 times the entire resources of the earth. Again, that's arable land. Our current global footprint is 1.85 Earths, which means that every year we as humans consume 1.85 times what the Earth can produce in a year. So that is not sustainable, because right now we have excess space. But we are going to reach a point where we are consuming more than the Earth can produce at a rate that is not sustainable. So here's your practice FRQ for this unit, or for this particular topic. I want you to describe one factor that accounts for the difference in carbon footprint between the US and Uganda. And I want you to explain one environmental consequence of that factor. This is carbon footprint, not global footprint. All right. Next, we're going to talk about sustainability. So as I said, our current usage is not sustainable. So what are some of the ways that we measure sustainability, as well as what are some of the things that can be done to increase sustainability? So we're going to define sustainability as consuming a resource in a way that does not deplete it or degrade it for future generations. Or we could talk about using a space in a way that doesn't deplete it or degrade it for future generations. So as an example, in order to fertilize fields or grass, synthetic fertilizers require the use of fossil fuels, but compost is a renewable resource. So using compost is more sustainable because it doesn't deplete the fossil fuel resource. When we talk about maximum sustainable yield, we're talking about the maximum amount of a renewable resource that can be harvested without depleting the resource for future use. And so this is a way of making sure that if we're talking about a resource like fish or anything that we harvest, that we are leaving enough for there to be enough to reproduce so that we can use it later. Or we're talking about harvesting sustainably in a forest, so that we are leaving forests, we're leaving trees so that they can regenerate for future use. In general, maximum sustainable yield is considered to be about 1/2 of the carrying capacity. This has balances maximizing yield, maximizing the amount that we're able to harvest, as well as maximizing the regeneration rate of the population. So what we're trying to do is balance how much we can use versus leaving enough for regeneration. So if we harvest at half of carrying capacity, in theory, that should be our maximum sustainable yield. So what are some of the ways that we can measure sustainability, or we can use as indicators of sustainability? These are the things that we use to help determine the health of the environment and guide us towards sustainable use. So first one is biodiversity. We've talked before about biodiversity, that we measure it on 3 different levels: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. If we have higher biodiversity, we have healthier ecosystems, more able to sustain a disruption, survive a disruption, more resilient, more resistant. When we have declining biodiversity, that can be an indicator of a pollution problem, it can be an indicator of habitat destruction, it can be an indicator of climate change. Extinction rate can be a very strong environmental indicator, because that species extinction is going to decrease our species richness on Earth. So biodiversity is one of our big indicators of sustainability. We want to keep biodiversity high in order to have a sustainable ecosystem. And you can see that our global extinction rate has skyrocketed in the last 120 years. This is over and above what we consider the background extinction rate. There are species going extinct all the time, but in the last 100 years, we've gone far. More species have gone extinct faster. Another indicator of global sustainability is food production. This indicates the ability of our soil, water, and climate to support agriculture. Some of the major threats to food production are climate change, because crops are no longer able to grow in the same locations that they were before because of changing seasons. Soil degradation, whether that's desertification from dryness or topsoil erosion from overuse. A huge piece of food production is groundwater use. So as groundwater is depleted, then that's also a major threat to food production. So climate change globally is decreasing agricultural productivity. You notice on our map here that productivity is actually increasing in the north. That's because seasons are getting longer, but overall globally it is decreasing. As countries move towards being developed nations rather than developing nations, as people develop more wealth, there is increased meat consumption. That's a further strain on food production. It takes away water and land from grain and vegetable production. But our global grain production per capita has actually leveled off and has shown signs of decline. So there are positive signs in our food production as well. Okay, atmospheric temperature and carbon dioxide. So life on Earth depends on a very narrow temperature range. You hear conversations in the news all the time about trying to maintain global climate change under 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's dependent, taking into consideration the fact that we depend on this very narrow temperature range. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. We know that it traps that infrared radiation, prevents it from escaping back into space, and it warms Earth's atmosphere. Increased carbon dioxide is going to result in increased temperature. So some of the reasons that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased so dramatically in the last 100 years include deforestation, because forests sequestered or trap that carbon dioxide. And at the same time, we're increasing dramatically since 1900 our combustion of fossil fuels, which emit carbon dioxide and increase atmospheric carbon dioxide. So on the one hand, we are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide we're pumping into the atmosphere. And on the other hand, we're decreasing our ability to remove that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Ever increasing amounts of carbon dioxide are unsustainable. It dries out our arable land, it destroys habitats, it worsens storm intensity, it melts polar ice caps. So the level percentage-wise or parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a strong indicator of global sustainability. Another impact on sustainability is human population size and therefore resource depletion. Because as our human population grows, we use more and more resources, so we deplete those resources. And we can see that there has been an explosion in the human population in the last 300 years. Especially as countries develop, resources tend to be harvested unsustainably from natural ecosystems, and that degrades the ecosystem health. And it's across the board. We use all kinds of resources. More paper leads to deforestation. More food leads to soil erosion because of agriculture, leads to deforestation. So we have more space for agriculture, leads to groundwater depletion from irrigating the crops. More people means more travel, which means more mining or extraction of fossil fuels, which leads to air, water, and soil pollution, and to habitat destruction, and to increased carbon dioxide emission. So you can see as our population increases, our deforestation increases as well. You can also see on one positive note that the amount of deforestation per person is actually decreasing. So we do have a positive there. Okay, so practice FRQ for this section is to take a look at the ecological footprints of these 5 students and explain which student most likely lives in a highly developed country, and describe how one, not all 4, but one of the categories of ecological footprint can serve as an indicator of environmental health. Okay, and that does it for today. And as always, let me know if you have questions, and I look forward to seeing you in class.